Hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome back to the fourth edition of the Tehran Summit, a virtual space for critical thought and artistic resistance, free from territorializing forces. My name is Erfan Riyasi, and I'm the co-curator of this year's summit alongside Una, Matisse, and Yered. This edition is a collaboration between BO, the Association of Visual Artists Oslo, and New Center of Research and Practice. Tonight, we're thrilled to continue our journey through a speculative theory and radical geography with a lecture by Carl Olsson, a writer and theorist whose work navigates deep train of a spatial philosophy, transcendental thought, and the human image in relation to nature and freedom. Carl recently completed a PhD in human geography at Newcastle University and has contributed to the Terraforming program at the Strelka Institute. He published in Urbanomics, Shum, and a range of academic journals, and currently teaches at the New Center for Research and Practice. His thinking opens up new planetary imaginaries while probing the architectures, both material and conceptual, that shapes our world. Please join me in welcoming Carl Olsson to the Terran Summit. Space is an angler, and we are the fish.
Thank you so much, Erfan, and thank you for having me. And hello, everyone. I am going to share this and this and this. Yeah, so tonight I'm going to talk about geography, which is going to be met in a kind of a European context, or a context of European geography and the European Enlightenment. Yesterday, Reza and Mohammed talked about briefly this kind of struggle for freedom and emancipation of the human being. Enlightenment is a kind of universal project for emancipation that cannot be limited to any place or time, or at least not be exhausted to it, even though, of course, as we know from history, there are concrete forms of it that have gone poorly, violently, and some good things have also come about, perhaps. Geography is a part of all this. And when I say geography, I mean the science of geography, the knowledge about ourselves and the world. So tonight I will speak about, and perhaps by speaking, also bringing about the destruction of a particular attempt to break nature in two. Historically, this discipline has been known as geography in the West. There is a common trope that associates geography with landscape motifs. But it would be better, perhaps, to view its foundation in terms of self-portraiture, as a conceptual rarefaction of the human figure from the ground of the world. Geography, in the sense that I will be talking about it today, is a matter of freeing ourselves from our environment through a use of concepts about ourselves. And we will look at a kind of historical trajectory through which geography in this particular sense is discovered, perhaps, but also reaches a kind of conclusion and is destroyed. And without further ado, in his Mimicry and Legendary Psychasthenia, the French sociologist Roger Caillois wrote that what may be one of the most tantalizing articles about space in the 20th century, pointing a way toward consolidating a wide array of natural and cultural histories. Caillois' text begins as an idiosyncratic interpretation of biological mimicry, focusing mostly on insects. Mimicry is a kind of camouflage that involves an organism modeling its appearance or behavior to resemble a specific object in its environment. There are several kinds of mimicry systems, and their employment yields different benefits, such as confounding predators or luring prey. Fish with eye spots near their posterior end and caterpillars resembling leaves are good examples of the evolutionary outcomes of such systems, where these fish where they have like eyes in the front, but then they have like a spot that resembles an eye, so a predator won't know in which direction it's going to swim. In brief, then, Kaiwa refuses the conventional interpretation and treats mimicry as a morbid phenomenon, a way of drawing closer to space. Resemblance serves an instinct of renunciation or an omnipresent tendency to become similar. Space is like an angler, baiting whoever tries to stand apart from it, drawing them in. There are undoubtedly some echoes of the death drive or the death instinct, Freud's notion of a ubiquitous wish to return to inanimate matter. We raised also a little bit of it yesterday. But Kaiwa's speculation about a topotropic or spaceward instinct is free from the theoretical baggage that supports Freud's speculation. It is not undertaken in a psychoanalytic context. Kaiwa is writing as a kind of naturalist from a perspective of a natural history that lacks this kind of all of the, literally the theoretical baggage, everything else that comes with psychoanalysis. So the allure of space is not a drive per se. It is a logical possibility opened by separation as such. It is pure, disinterested geometry, which makes it far more disturbing, I think, than any drive could ever be. It is simply the way that the world is. For the spaceward prospect does not only act on morphology, the allure of absolute identity, immanence, extension, similarity, and morbid repetition extends into neurological, symbolic, and even conceptual areas. The task that is left by Kaiwa is to germinate his idea, allowing it to spire into a double history of independence from space and the renunciation of this independence, joined together like the two sides of a coin. The neurological extension, to begin somewhere, finds some genuine support from the biologists Simona Ginsberg and Eva Jablonka in a recent work, who associate the ability to learn to respond to repeated patterns with the origin of consciousness. If organisms are to avoid getting stuck on images, confuse themselves with their environments, or suffer crippling trauma, they must be able to forget. This is how they learn. So learning implies forgetting. Sensitivity to images must go hand in hand with active forgetting, or it would just be another sort of absolute immanence. If you can take in all information that is coming from the outside world without being able to sort of sort and forget certain parts, you're going to be very hurt, is their argument. Just think about it a little bit. And their staggering conclusion, or kind of suggestion, can be taken to an even more extreme conclusion, I think. Any new liberty implies a new type of flirtation with assimilation into the external world. Freedom requires continuous labor, which is to say that indifference is the default state of being. It's sometimes said that, what goes up must come down, at least under kind of the conditions of Earth's gravity. But for something to come down, of course, first it must have gone up. So the further one climbs, the more ways of falling there are. And according to Kaiwa, the threat of space returns once again with the new concept of space introduced by 19th century science and mathematics. He says, it is with represented space that the drama becomes specific. Since the living creature, the organism, is no longer the origin of the coordinates, but the one point among others. It is dispossessed of its privilege and literally no longer knows where to place itself. But why do representations of space have these effects? Indeed, why do they? I think that he's probably wrong that sort of a representation of ourselves in space is alienating in some sense, or would draw us closer to space. The prolongation of the tendency toward assimilation would be better understood in connection to the dissipative effects of philosophical naturalism on the human self-understanding. The problem is better understood grammatically rather than perspectively. It's not a matter of representing ourselves as in space, and that would kind of draw us closer to space, but rather there is something in the meaning in which we represent ourselves where we might find some kind of confusion. Now, this latter problem, in slightly different terms, has been given a range of interpretations throughout the 20th century. As the darker consequences of the European Enlightenment in particular have come into view as a void behind the parting of the clouds. And now we're going to delve into something that it's going to become slightly more technical now. Because I'm going to kind of narrate this story and try to position geographical knowledge at its very center, a particular kind of vulnerability in the Enlightenment project that can be exploited and perhaps warded against. Wilfrid Sellars, the American philosopher, his distinction between manifest and scientific images of man in the world will serve as a good kind of heuristic device here. It being one of the attempts to kind of narrate how there's a conflict between naturalistic representations of the human being in the sense of we are what sciences tell us that we are, a part of nature, and the kind of the humanistic ideals of the Enlightenment, of freedom and reason, which he puts in the manifest image. What Sellars terms the manifest image precisely operates within an explanatory framework that uses the concept of persons who believe themselves to be acting according to reasons, norms, and individual intentions. A person in this sense is basically someone who experiences internal episodes and intentional states and whose life is, as Sellars allegedly put it, fraught with ought. That is, a person is a subject of intentions who can be held responsible as such. The manifest image is also populated by many different non-persons, such as trees, mobile phones, storms, and rocks, mid-sized objects. These entities are treated as explanatorily salient. If, to do the old philosopher's example of just taking two things from the desk, if my cup hits the roll of tape, that is a kind of an explanation for what has happened in this framework. Developments of the manifest image have been made in the perennial tradition, as Sellars calls it, of philosophy, extending from Aristotle through to ordinary language perspectives, and it seems relatively safe to say that for the most part, people view themselves and the world based on some version of it. On Sellars' speculative account, the manifest image gradually developed from an original image in which personhood encompassed a wider range of natural phenomena like weather and winds. In the early stages of the manifest image, these entities became truncated persons whose causal power was gradually replaced with the predictable, habitual actions of objects as we usually know them. Increasingly, things became known through universal causality and other laws. The development of the manifest image is a story of restricted personhood. The scientific image, of course, goes further. It takes the restriction of personhood to its extreme conclusion via the, quote, postulation of imperceptible entities and the principles pertaining to them to explain the behavior of perceptible things. Protons and electrons are examples of entities within the scientific image, but so are the concepts of behavioristic models insofar as these can be thought to kind of supervene on neurophysiological, biological, and physical entities, such as the aforementioned microphysical particles. Basically, something that we cannot see, or a kind of a posited entity of some sort, explains the behavior of the things that appear to us and that we're used to talking about. According to the scientific image, the entities of its manifest counterpart are really constituted by physical systems that are ultimately explainable by the postulates about the aforementioned particles or entities that can be modeled across different levels, and somehow these levels are kind of going to be put together. Ultimately, these postulates comprise a different kind of description compared to the explanations proper to the manifest image. So it's a genuine alternative. The problem is, of course, and those of you who know Sellars will know this also, that concepts like persons, norms, and intentions that we use to orient ourselves in the world on a daily basis are not really part of the scientific image at all. In other words, the latter is a conceptual lattice work according to which the imputed efficacy of imperceptible entities upon the objects of ordinary perception, including ourselves, can be modeled, tested, and revised. So while the scientific image is supposed to have grown out of the manifest image, eventually, Sellars thinks, the sciences will reach a point of theoretical unification, and whatever is said to exist according to this ultimate image will be able to exhaustively explain the entities we usually accept. In principle, it threatens a kind of supersession of our manifest image everyday reality. The problem, to say it a bit more elaborately, is of course that the scientific image lacks the conceptual resources to account for the normatively infused concepts that are the hallmarks of the manifest image, including important concepts like person and explanation themselves. In other words, it threatens to work backwards and erode its own foundations. And this is a problem. If for no other reason than that of philosophical coherence, but also how are we going to kind of merge these two different things? Eliminating these concepts, like person and explanation, would, as I just said, risk rendering kind of scientific practices unintelligible. So invoking the distinction between normative and causal facts, Sellars notes that the irreducibility of the personal is the irreducibility of the ought to the is. And so the priority of the scientific image can only extend to explanations or descriptions. Otherwise, this conflict or kind of clash would create a hard sort of contradiction. It can only be a limited supersession. So faced with the contradictions that would result from eliminating the notion of persons from our conceptual repertoire, Sellars suggested that a more limited replacement, indeed, of the scientific image could happen, of the manifest image, sorry, could happen through a dialectical integration or fusion of the two images into some sort of synoptic view, which has been widely debated since Sellars wrote this in the early 70s. What would such a view mean and what would it kind of entail? In this view, at least, the necessary and irreducible concepts of the manifest image somehow enrich and map onto the scientific image framework so as to relate the latter back to us in our vernacular world. Thus, although the role of the personal in the manifest image is conceptually irreducible, it remains in principle causally reducible in the scientific image. And the cognitive sciences may one day provide full neurophysiological explanations and descriptions of what we now call persons. Some might say they are well on their way to getting there already. Others might vehemently disagree with that. This solution to the problem, however, and this is how we're going to kind of work our way back to geography and its centrality. This solution to the problem that Sellars posits of mapping the two images together relies on the Kantian notion of a transcendental unity of apperception, expressed in the possibility of adding "I think" as an empty subject of one's thoughts. What Kant calls the transcendental unity of apperception is a form of experience, according to Sellars, rather than a substance or entity. And through it, it could be possible to, Sellars think, to mention rather than use the framework to which the concept of person belongs. The way I understand it is basically that you need, in order to merge two different images, and this is why I think that the ontology or the heuristic of images is so important. To merge two images, you need a subject that somehow does the merging or the unification and the navigation between the two. And this is what Kant manages to supply here to Sellars. Without this sort of form of experience, there would be no possible means to, there would be no one or nothing to actually kind of navigate the contradiction in the first place. So mediation between the images is possible because there is a form of experience that can use concepts to refer to the world in different ways without being implicated in the world itself. Absolute immanence is suspended by critical distance. And this is why what is sometimes referred to as the transcendental subject is so incredibly kind of philosophically important. Or this is what it enables, or some version of it. The crux of the tension between the manifest and scientific images is navigating between different concepts of what one is in the world. What we are, in some sense, dealing with, that we are, okay, sorry, I got lost in my own text. So basically, that we are in some sense dealing with an intrinsically geographical challenge is clear, I think, from Sellars' designation of the human in the world as the motive of the clashing images. That is, it's not a matter of a representation of the human being, and it's not really a representation of the world that is the problem. The problem lies precisely, or even the kind of the subject matter of these images, what's at stake in them is the human in the world. And if geography, as I've argued, is a matter of self-portraiture rather than landscape, then this is eerily similar to it. The images portray neither humans devoid of context nor the world without inquirer. They are, as once again, precisely images of human beings in their world. Sorry to push this so much, but I think it's crucially important. So that the putative solution to the clash of the images appeals to a structurally constrained form of experience means that the clash that Sellars anticipates really is a problem that concerns how a system that can locate a self in the environment can understand this self in different, conceptually reducible and even incompossible ways. In this sense, the notion of a clash between different images might be seen less as a prediction and more as a kind of prospective derangement of the remarkable ease with which we routinely move between different types of representations of ourselves in the world. In other words, as long as we rely on a form of experience to represent ourselves in different ways, conceptually completely different ways, everything that concerns how these representations are simply a play of what we're doing. Working artists, scientists, and children that play, they jump between images of themselves without any problems at all. Sellars' exposition of the clash suggests two things that will return us to the capacity of thought to work as a return to the embrace of space. In other words, Sellars kind of exposition or ontology of images, even if you will help us kind of get back to the centrality of geography, because geography, I will try to argue now, is nothing else than the play of the play that we conduct between different representations of ourselves in the world. Everything of how the sciences are related to each other and sort of how they portray the human being, and I mean sciences in the broadest possible sense, has a geographical component to them. So I would like to go through two things now, yeah? First, the conceptual tension that is the result of naturalism in the European Enlightenment concerns a clash of two conceptual frameworks. This is what we can say after going through Sellars. The cartoonish image of someone sawing off the branch on which they sit in a tree is not entirely inappropriate here with the kind of the putative clash. But it is not something that must happen to a culture, since we possess the means to navigate self-representations. It is not a necessary outcome. Secondly, Sellars' postulate Kantian solution that enables our acrobatic use of concepts points to a more fundamental problem that must have been resolved before the challenge of gluing together different frameworks can even begin. Before there could be a clash of different images, the production of images depicting the human in the world must first have taken place. So Sellars' framing of the long-standing conflict between naturalism and humanism, as I put it in a more general sense, therefore sits on top of a transcendental foundation that is intimately concerned with dividing space, of dividing ourselves from space, from nature, cutting nature in two, the human and that which is not the human, the person and that which is not the person. As a consequence, it is necessary to engage with Kant's construal of the transcendental subject's paradoxical status in order to understand the mechanism through which the scientific image could threaten to undo it, rather than the manifest image. In other words, is there a way in which naturalistic representations of ourselves could go beyond the concept of the person and impinge upon that which makes the concept of the person possible in the first place? A deeper conflict. Can then the status of the transcendental subject be imperiled by its conception of the world? If we ask Kant, the answer might depend on what we mean by imperiled. The starting point for any discussion about the representation of the transcendental subject in the world, in this sense, must be the paralogisms of pure reason in the first critique, the critique of pure reason. Specifically, contradictions of judgment that amounts to what Kant calls subreptions of the conditions of objectively valid judgments. In this strange term, subreption comes originally from Roman law, where these subreptions were criminal subversions of justice, for example, by deliberately introducing of false evidence into legal proceedings. From there, the term was appropriated by Christian Wolff, for whom it came to mean a kind of a conceptual confusion in general. And then Kant builds on Wolff's legacy and uses the term to refer to certain dialectical errors. One subreption is, of course, particularly important, namely what Kant calls the subreption of hypostatized consciousness, or apperceptionis substantiate, which occurs when an act of determining the self in time and sometimes space is conflated with the determinable self, that is, with the transcendental subject. And that this is what I've been told when I mentioned a deeper conflict. This seems to be precisely it. I am because I think, said Descartes, but that does not entitle me to say anything about what sort of thing the thinking is. I can only so basically, let's see what's on the next one. Okay, let's stay here for a second. So basically, Descartes says that I am because I think, but Kant is going to say sort of, wait a minute, what are you? Or sort of, what kind of thing are you? And in order to be able to answer this, Kant is going to say, well, you can only determine yourself within the forms of space and time. However, in order to do that, there needs to be an act of determination. And when this act of determination is conflated with that which is determines, i.e. the self, one of these subreptions occurs. So the targets of Kant's critique are basically the rational psychologists rather than scientific naturalists here. So when he writes this, he is concerned with people like Descartes. And while the formal properties of the problem, as I just described it, are the same in each case, I think the content differs. So crucial to apprehending this difference is that Kant requires thought to conceive itself as spontaneous, which is to say, not implicated in the causal order in some way. With the forward march of the scientific image, what used to be an innocent error then, therefore becomes a veritable disaster, because the rational psychologists are capable of securing the spontaneity of thought via a kind of soulful fiat in the shape of a thinking substance. Even if, according to Kant, the rationalists commit an error from the vantage of the critical apparatus, they are at least able to buttress the transcendental freedom of thought. They're able to kind of maintain spontaneity. They're able to kind of literally maintain thought's ability to think. And what's at stake in this is ultimately even the existence of thought itself. At least Kant will strongly maintain that if you do not represent your thought as free, then really you're not thinking at all. So not so for the naturalist, who will kind of happily impinge on thinking also at the level of content. If thought is a thing or process in the causal order and the natural world, it is notably not free. As Robert Pippin argues, it is, however, unlikely that Kant would admit that thought could think a thought that destroys the conditions of thought. How would that even make sense? However, I think that such a self-abjuring thought would not count as a thought, because it would not fulfill the conditions of thinking. And there's a difference here between it being an unthinkable thought being a strict impossibility, and it simply being not a thought. In other words, it is a something that does not really count. So the right way to talk about it is not in terms of annihilation, but rather as an unexpected absence resulting from a particular kind of illegitimate use. In Sellars' construal, the conflict between the images obviously plays out as a conflict of images. However, what is at stake now is the very constitution of the images as such. So ultimately, the problem is the other side of the question of how science first originated in the world. If there is a clash, if the scientific image grows and there is suddenly a multiplicity of ways of representing ourselves in the world, the question is, how does this even come about? And the other side of this is precisely what is the conditions of representing ourselves in the world to begin with. For the simple reason that we're going to have to build this up in order to sort of, this is the object of the critique that I've kind of been targeting. If we fail these conditions, then everything comes crashing down as a house of cards that is poorly built. So if we are looking for images of the human being in the world as the site of the problem, the first science must concern the empirical conception of the world and the human in it. And here, once again, Kant has an answer, and he calls it knowledge of the world, Weltkenntnis in his native German. And he divides it in two parts, geography and anthropology, with geography being the first part of the knowledge of the world. I'm going to stay for 1 second and just note that there is an interesting dynamic that plays out between these two disciplines in Kant, where geography is a representation of essentially the human being in nature, and anthropology is an understanding of the, at least in the pragmatic sense, as Kant says, of how what the human makes of itself. And they play together, and in a sense come then already here we see a way that there are two different ways of talking about the human being in the world as distinctive images, where anthropology is concerned very much with that which Sellars called the personal, with the manifest image, and geography is, at least in principle, open to a more naturalistic way of explaining the human being. It's almost as if, from the viewpoint of the transcendental subject, which would be kind of the subject of both of these sciences, the subject position, there is a strange kind of doubling where the personal, or the person in anthropology, is presented as a kind of sacrifice that can be put in conflict with the representations that come from geography, as if the concept of a person safeguards the very possibility of thought. Foucault had a kind of an interesting term when in relationship to Kant, where he talked about an empirical transcendental doublet. And I think this might be sort of the explanation for that. It's a way of protecting thought from its own thoughts. Geography is, of course, not first science in the order of explanations, in a kind of as a candidate to replace physics or something like that. And in its guise as a fully formed discipline, it is certainly not first in a historical sense either. It's interesting to note that Kant is probably the first person that has a normative or a kind of an essentialist theory about what geography is as knowledge of the world in this way. It is first, however, in the logical sense of being the science of the unified world in which we are. Socrates would not have found his way to his dialogues without a modicum of geographical knowledge. Gilgamesh and Enkidu would not have found their way to Humbaba's forest. Geography begins with the distribution of the concept of a person within the world. As if in a self-portrait, the boundaries or borders of the figure are defined and cut off from the surrounding ground. It is by virtue of asserting its subject's place in a coherent world that geography deserves the name of first science and the origin of enlightenment in the sense of this kind of emancipatory process through self-knowledge. Geography is constitutive of a certain kind of resistance to space itself. And if we identify geography as a kind of conceptual self-portraiture, as a figuring oneself out in the world, then to identify the threat the scientific image poses for the ground of science, we must look for a subversion of the conditions of conceptual self-portraiture in general, for the conditions of geography, of geographical knowledge. If we are interested in a kind of deeper conflict, which would imperil the prospects of scientific thought in general, geography is the place where we must look. So for any kind of all-out attack, be it because we want to attack it or for some kind of methodological reason, for any kind of all-out attack on the Enlightenment as process of emancipation in this sense, geography is where we should aim. And the best horror stories do not show terror on their patients' faces. They generally follow a joyful but incomprehensible march into destruction. Oh, like this. And the end of the 1990s saw a series of connected turns in British cultural geography. So now we're going to, if that wasn't clear, now I'm going to quickly go looking for such a situation. Is there a site or a location or a time and a place where a destruction of geography might take place? So these turns led to a theoretical reactivation of space and decentralization of subjectivity away from the kind of the coalesced life history of the individual human being. Prior to this time, geographical thinking had for some time been interested in landscape perspectives and kind of reading and interpreting landscapes, but there was a kind of a counter reaction where there was a strong interest in trying to kind of inscribe subjectivity into the world as a spatial process. Some might kind of recognize this from other academic disciplines, where there's a kind of an interest in materiality and so on. And something similar happens in cultural geography. So, for instance, Doreen Massey wished to recuperate a more intimate conception of space intended, quote, almost like a shift of physical position from an imagination of a textuality at which one looks towards recognizing one's place within continuous and multiple processes of emergence, end quote. A few years earlier, J.D. Dewsbury and colleagues had argued that, quote, there is a need to move away from speaking of affections and perceptions, which would overemphasize a too subjective, too human account, to move towards an account that takes seriously the world's own forces. In more and less radical ways, the human being would be reinscribed into the world. And with an eye to these changes, geographer Paloma Puente Lozano has recently argued that geographical thought underwent an important transition from treating space as kind of explanandum, or sort of that which is to be explained, to treating it as explanans, from seeing space as something that is to be explained to seeing it as something that possesses explanatory or even constitutive power of its own. In other words, and I think she's absolutely right about this, geographical thought has undergone a kind of a shift from where people are trying to figure out spatial outcomes, but rather explain outcomes with the help of spatial processes of various kinds. Cognizing subjects, notably, became spatial processes in this shift. So the proponents and critics of geography's turn to explanatory space, they have focused on various cultural, political, ethical, basically practical aspects that ramify from attacks on subjectivity. But the theoretical problem that I have outlined here, created by the activation of space, has been overlooked. And I mean particularly then the activation of space vis-a-vis the human being, as though subjectivity could be explained by space. A problem that is at once deeper and more intractable than both its practical reverberations and the clash of the images predicted by Sellars, which I kind of argued at length. The materialist turn in geographical thought reveals a sort of vulnerability that exemplifies the lure of space, I think, better than Kaiwa's worry over the mathematical spaces of the 19th century. Hence my kind of semantic construal rather than sort of a perspectival problem that sort of that Kaiwa would have posited in relationship to kind of representations of space as being the next step, the most recent step in a general vulnerability that all living beings have to being pulled back into the environment or to kind of lose their autonomy. So through this, the geographical project reaches a conclusion even as its corpse shambles onward into the 21st century. Notably, what is kind of imperiled or implicated in this moment in cultural geography is not only the kind of subjectivity in a general sense, it is also through a range of kind of experimental practices and arguments, it is also the geographers themselves. And this would be kind of the really kind of conclusion of geographical thought, where everything kind of comes crashing down. If they are serious about this, if they were serious about this, really, they're risking kind of the entire possibility of kind of geographical thought as a particular kind. They're exiting the geographical thought as a particular kind of cognition and everything that comes with it. So geography is then the site where dialectical errors become fully fledged dialectical disasters. It is the threshold beyond which the dialectics of individual emancipation transform from a physiological into a conceptual affair. And although contemporary human geographers embrace in general a kind of a critical attitude to save the discipline from its past transgressions, their deconstruction of subjectivity make them uniquely vulnerable to the lure of space. And of course, this kind of critical attitude was what motivated this kind of reinscription of the subject in space to begin with. Nevertheless, it is as if geography's attempt at a moral recuperation only betrays its monstrous essence, because without this kind of mode of cognition that it relies on and that sets the entire kind of self-interested motion of the Enlightenment in its kind of historical sense in motion, there would be no geographical thought at all. So to round this part up, geography deals with space in a manner that is kind of functionally analogous with other organs in the service of individual emancipation when it functions. Where a membrane creates a physiological barrier and fingers serve manipulation, geography institutes rules of self-representation which, when they are obeyed, liberate the human animal from its environment and erect the foundation for the process of enlightenment just as a kind of a cognitive technology. A skillful practitioner can represent themselves in any way, even blend into the world like a chameleon. I am this, I am that, I am no one at all, but only because I can constitute myself through thought. It is possible to utilize mimicry as long as you know that you are behind the veil, right? Turn yourself into this or that, wear any mask you'd like, anyone at all, well, almost, because some masks kind of turn the joke around on their wearers and are actually the agents of space itself. I'm gonna pause there for a second. I might continue later depending on how we feel with a different story. Open up the room for everyone if anyone wants to say something. I know that was a lot and quite technical, so I'm happy to kind of elaborate on any part of this drama, or if it's desirable, I can also go deeper towards into the black hole.
Thank you so much, Carl. Amazing and very intricate presentation, I would say. A critical presentation about correlationism. And I want to ask if you see yourself within this framework of a speculative realism, or um, especially like in relation to Ray, because you also mentioned Sellers.
Yeah, I think the simple answer is that I mean I'm going to go into short kind of intellectual personal biography here. I'm not sure how sort of how important or how interesting it is, but of course these things do determine where we end up. But I mean, I started reading. I mean, I'm trained as a cultural geographer. I'm coming from this background, and one figure that is very large in this is kind of Deleuze. And I started reading Deleuze when, I mean, it's not that many years ago, but and then of course this is kind of a, as for many people, a gateway drug into philosophy. And on this road, I encountered Meyasu and Ray Brassier, Ray, quite quite early on, I think. But of course, also much later than sort of much of this transpired in philosophy. So I encountered this was maybe in 2016, 17. And of course, this has had an influence on me. One of the things that I was thinking for a very long time is sort of like, why is there no uptake of this in geography itself? And so this is maybe a one of the guiding questions that have kind of led to this work. Of course, one just in relation to the notion of correlationism. I mean, of course, I think geography as a discipline, in the sense that I've used it here, is intrinsically correlational, but I think that at the moment, at least, we should perhaps be in a position where we are capable of talking of different types of correlations that have different constraints. And what Kant seems to describe in the Critique of Pure Reason, I'm a kind of fan of what's his name? Michael Friedman, I think, who would talk about kind of a constitutive a priori, where different kind of sciences in principle have different kinds of um, um, constraints and different kinds of kind of a priori criteria. And what Kant is really describing then in the Critique of Pure Reason is kind of the possibility of Newtonian science and its conditions. And I think that geographical knowledge is thoroughly kind of beholden to this. It's almost as if there's a reading that goes between Kant's philosophy of geography that he outlines in the introduction to his truly monstrous lectures on physical geography and the Critique of Pure Reason, that sort of has been very difficult for people to figure out the link between. But I think uh, this is kind of my take on it. So I think did that help with kind of understanding a little bit of where I'm
Yeah,
coming from?
yeah, definitely. I can see yourself being the fifth member of the speculative realism, just
Uh-huh.
talking about correlationism from the geography framework. It's just a different way of. I've been like reading SR, but and also I've been reading texts from like for example like Trevor Peglin, but I've never thought of it as combining the two forces, which is something that you were doing, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is very much post speculative realism. I feel like there's a particular set of philosophical problems that sort of that kind of transpire in at this kind of that transpired in this philosophical moment. Whereas for me, I think the range of problems are slightly different, precisely through this kind of relativization of a correlational structure, so that what is at stake is here is really a kind of type autonomy or kind of freedom that is produced through a particular way of thinking about oneself in the world. That is, many geographers that are kind of critical at the moment of sort of geography's history, and for very good reason. The problem is that there is not only the kind of the real kind of violence that has been committed through this discipline, there's also the kind of intrinsic violence that lies in its very internal grammar. And getting out of this is much more difficult, and can be sort of, and this is basically what I'm looking here for. And if someone, it also kind of, I think, shows the sort of almost the necessity of a particular kind of grammatical violence, how difficult it is to escape. That I think is easily underestimated, and sort of I don't have a strong kind of normative stance, I think, about what is to be done, but I think it's crucial for that we understand sort of the where we're at with this.
Yeah, definitely. If anybody has any questions, they can write it in chat. I can read it, and also you can simply raise your hand. Just refer, like, sort of connecting your presentation with sort of the title of the summit. Do you see, and also what you just mentioned, Deleuze, do you see the black holes as sort of the new lines of flights, or I don't know, these forces that, in a sense, erase the question? Like, how do you interpret this, like, this object of
Yeah.
black holes, you know?
I think that I'm going to answer with a kind of through a different kind of Deleuze-Guattarian concept, which is kind of that of becoming animal or becoming this or that. And it's sort of course, throughout A Thousand Plateaus in particular, they never stop of kind of warning about the dangers of becoming otherwise. And I think that there's a very strong, in this particularly what I outlined at the end of kind of in cultural geography, people will be talking about the non-representational theory, and it's very kind of driven by a very strong Deleuzian inspiration, I think. And I think that there is, just to kind of translate what I said before in these terms, I think one, it is much more difficult to kind of initiate any kind of really kind of fundamental break with the strata, or any kind of becoming that would actually become productive than what is often thought. I think by and large, there's a kind of, especially in theoretical, any kind of humanities discourse, there's a kind of an underestimation of difficulty. And I think likewise, there is a massive underestimation of the dangers, that we must be able to at least reckon with the possibility that it's the case that any kind of becoming otherwise is likely to go to shit, and to sort of either spiral out of control and become something truly monstrous, or simply just not work. And I mean, I don't want to be a pessimist, but I think I sort of, at the same time, I feel like somehow whatever I look at turns into a horror story, and this is just kind of a personal quirk, I suppose. But I think this is kind of what I want to draw out here. That sort of there's a what if it's kind of the difficulties are much greater than what many people that have been reading this literature would hope.
But the whole presentation felt like you're sort of promoting cosmic pessimism in a sense, you know? It's just, is there any way out of this sort of grid in which we are trapped, you know?
I think this is a truly kind of experimental question. Unfortunately, I do not have an answer. I think I am personally, it's also kind of really a kind of, this is where, if there's an ethical dimension to this, I think this is where it enters, precisely because these are questions that have to be dealt with, I think, in a piecemeal manner, on a case-by-case basis, in the same way that sort of yesterday I jumped in quickly on Mo's behest and sort of talked about in relation to what Reza was saying about this kind of critique of transcendental structures. And I think in this for me, this is a part of it, looking precisely at sort of a critique of, okay, what does it actually take for us to kind of think about ourselves in our environment? And I think it's always a matter of doing this kind of in relation to something very specific, and in order to kind of really see what plays out within this particular domain. Of course, we need very grand philosophical gestures, and I mean, maybe I am also grandiose, but at the same time, we need to sort of really sit with each particular kind of series of constraint and really spend some time with them and see what is really going on there.
And would you mind talking about the way you use the word gymnastics to your current presentation?
Did I use the word gymnastics?
Not here, but like previously in your previous talks.
Yeah. I think this is simply so basically I'm interested in different ways that we kind of break free from our environment in a very kind of physical sense. And I think that sort of via representation and self-representation, as in geography, is one of them. But then there are, of course, more physical and kind of embodied ways of doing so. I think that ultimately I'm sort of my kind of, how to put it, I think I have very strong kind of naturalistic inclinations, and I intuitively sense that sort of some kind version of a hard scientific naturalism that's totally bald, to use McDowell's term, is probably true, but it just leads to such kind of philosophical problems for me that I just dwell in it, and sort of so I end up in this conflict that I'm outlining again and again. And I think that sort of going towards more embodied sort of really corporeal practices here is a way for me to look at something else than this kind of cognitive situation.
Case I don't know, Mo, Georgiana. I think there's a question in the chat. Would you be able to expand on your understanding of horror? Do you see it as a final destination or a possible moment of catharsis, in a sense that we can depart the system through horror as the force?
Oh, this is a very good question. If only, I mean, probably for many reasons, but one reason is that I don't really have an answer. And how do I understand horror? I think ultimately I think in a very intuitive sense, if something feels like a something feels deeply aphoretic, and as if we are just intellectually or kind of conceptually stuck in a contradiction, and there is no way of getting out. This to me is a kind of horror story in itself, and I think this is kind of the truest form of horror, that we are in something and we just cannot get out of it. And I think this is the sort of problems that I personally often keep on encountering when I try to do some kind of philosophical project. So this is why I sort of joke that everything turns into a horror story for me.
Georgiana?
Yeah, I wanted to add the saying, if it feels like a trap, then you're already in one. So
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you to perhaps return and elaborate on your distinction that you make between indifference as the state of being and freedom, which requires labor.
Yeah.
And indifference being the bait. Did I understand correctly? Which one is the bait? Which one is the tantalizing force? This desire for freedom that also kind of punishes us, or can be felt as a punish because it requires effort and uncertainty. Or the bait is just to preserve our state of being, therefore be staying still, being immobile, being like a little stone in a landscape.
Yeah, I mean, everything will depend on one's perspective, I suppose, as things generally are. I think that when I say that labor, some kind of labor or work is required for freedom, I mean it in the kind of the sense of there is some kind of metabolism ultimately that is necessary for life to sustain itself. If you as a living being just sit still, then eventually you're going to perish, and the kind of the boundary that kind of sustains you and differentiates you from that which you are not is going to cease being there, and you're going to kind of entropically dissolve into the environment. So ultimately, I mean, death is indifference in this sense. But I mean, generally, I mean, the biological concept of autonomy is quite helpful here. Both that it has been kind of clarified through, or kind of developed through the sort of the kind of Varela and Maturana, but also more recently in by different people. Just let me, I'm losing the name, Bernd Rossenbroich, and but there are. I'll see if I can write it later. Basically, where autonomy is a degree of kind of really a kind of an emancipation from the environment that is both articulated through kind of a physical barrierization against the environment, but also kind of interactively, so that we gain a kind of a flexibility of behavior in relationship to the environment that surrounds us. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
What would be for you the traps or the limitations that, let's say, the Enlightenment first generation geographers, the Enlightenment travelers and taxonomers and so on, what would have been their faults or limitations? Because I would say that there are also specific kinds of very busy and sophisticated types of indifference to a landscape, or indifference or keeping the environment at a distance, which turns into some sort of coldness, inflexibility, or downright, dominance over it. Like, and colonization is linked to it, and so on. So all the evils of holding, clawing to a space.
This strikes me as a completely different kind of, I might be wrong here, because there's also, I'm going to say why I might be wrong first, and then I'm going to say what I think. I might be wrong because I think there could very well be that sort of there's a, like almost if you have like a color gradient and everything fades to white, there is no difference. And if everything fades to black, there is also no difference. And so there are perhaps two ways of being, of losing oneself in this way. And I think morally that might be true. But the kind of the indifference that someone that is overviewing a landscape and is very distanced from it, I think this is, in this kind of imagined gradient, this is a kind of a middle position of absolute, of very high kind of freedom of action for this kind of person. And this is where kind of geography's historical association with a kind of, with I think colonial violence comes in and is kind of enabled. It is precisely by this kind of distancing from the landscape in which the geographer is very free, very emancipated. But through this kind of emancipation, it is possible to kind of treat the other as simply a part of the landscape and the background. And I think this is where this is why geography is also kind of inherently kind of a little bit monstrous, because it is this kind of, it's not only a kind of emancipation, but it's precisely the way that kind of emancipation always kind of proffers power that can be a way and a means to exploit something else. Because of course, I mean, we don't even have to go to look at sort of recent history, but sort of course, the reason if an animal is kind of free to behave, if another animal is free to behave very flexibly, I mean, of course, this is going to be most of the time violently so. We might disagree about this, but of course, it comes with a tremendous potential for sort of going around and kind of eating others. So, and I mean this not as a kind of a comparison between human history and cultural history, but sort of simply a kind of a really, if we are going to be kind of count autonomy as a kind of a biological concept, we do have to do so through ourselves too, and kind of read ourselves through this kind of continuity, and then sort of after the fact ask ourselves, okay, what are the moral implications of understanding ourselves in this way? Yeah, it is grisly business, geography.
Yeah, so like confronting the sinister within.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Just for your information, the room will stop in like 15 minutes, so we do have a 15-minute to continue with the session, and I think we do have a question in the chat box. Federico says, thanks for the insightful presentation, Carl. I just wanted to ask if we can turn to when you mentioned becoming becomes dangerous or catastrophic, can be seen as a strategy to overturn contemporary deterministic reactionary conception of individuation. Do you see a nihilistic potency in humanity thrashing out their own self-image versus a continuous improving of the human in rigid fascistic stasis, taxonomy of our species as fixed type, eugenics as proposed by paleo libertarians?
I mean, I think this is a thank you for the question, Federico. I think this is a question that is very difficult for me to answer for the simple reason that sort of although it kind of concerns the concepts that I talked about, I am just not competent in sort of being able to answer whether or not where things are going to go from here, if that makes sense. If that makes sense, if kind of basically if I understand the question correctly, I really don't kind of know if it's kind of, yeah, I think maybe either I don't understand the question sufficiently, or it feels difficult for me to answer it in a kind of a cohesive way. If you try to just elaborate it a slightly bit differently, I will give it another shot. I hope that's okay, Federico.
Maybe if I can just briefly intervene. Yeah,
Please.
Just like reducing it, and thank you, Carl, to the idea of taking this like nihilistic danger or catastrophic limit that's always there embedded in becoming something, if that can be used as a sort of exit, to say at least, of certain constraints that are given ideologically in how human self-image is portrayed. Like, at least in, like, it's been always like that, at least I think, like, politically. But I think mostly like in our epoch, we're just like returning to essentialism, a dangerous sort of essentialism. I mentioned paleo-libertarians as an example, like, let's say, rampant ideology in Silicon Valley and whatnot. But
Yeah.
I don't know if you would, avow, let's say, this nihilistic strategy that is embedded in becoming something, or if we can do a shortcut to another type of concept or strategy that doesn't deal with becoming something. Yeah, I don't know if this is like darkening the waters even more, but yeah.
No, I think it helps a lot, and I think it also gave me a tiny bit of time to sort of sit with it. I think that basically this is why I think there's some kind of ethical situation here, in the sense that it has to be done kind of that any kind of break has to be done piecemeal. I think there is, first of all, a kind of an important distinction to be made here between the kind of the epistemological kind of critique that I'm sort of I was trading in today, and a kind of a commentary on a political situation. And I think the sort of the motivations in each case, even if they are related, are probably slightly different, and the stakes are maybe slightly different. Though of course intertwined, but at least analytically they seem to me at least to be somewhat different. So I think that for in the case of kind of geographical knowledge, just kind of to stick with the side of things where I feel like I know a little bit. The choice is always going to be between sort of perpetuating the form of the act, and sort of banking on there being a kind of an escape. So, and I mean, this is not such a binary choice, I suppose. It's always a kind of a piecemeal thing. I think what these kind of cultural geographers at the end of the 1990s show, in any case, within the context of their discipline, is that there is some kind of outside, there is kind of another set of spatial practices that might do different things. And what really sort of comes out of this is perhaps a need to think about when we should engage in the use of a given faculty. When should we engage in geographical knowledge, and when should we not? And sort of what else, this sounds horribly vague, I'm sure, but sort of these are also kind of the questions that I'm trying to think through now. Just to give a little bit of context, is there a kind of almost like a gyroscopic sort of situation where one goes back and forth between different forms of kind of spatial cognition? Or is it more like, okay, we have to destroy geographical knowledge and kind of start all over with something else? I don't really have an answer for that, I think. I'm not sure if this clarifies anything at all, or if it makes it worse. What do you think, Federico?
Thank you, Carl. No, I actually think I was thinking it also as well on how ethics, and I'm gonna not extend myself too much as well. Ethics is also linked to this idea of how we are oriented towards space, towards spatiality, how it's constructed transcendentally, and all of the implications that has, in a historical sense. And I think that last question you're asking yourself is quite valuable to see if we need to reorient or redirect our own conception of orientation, or if we need to start anew, sort of like tabula rasa, and burn it all, and try to have a new conception of space itself, without these implications of, let's say, cruelty against the other, or we can probably be cruel towards ourselves, but towards like this sort of limit that deforms this sort of stasis that could be fascist in the end, like in a political sense, or probably also like a big question, I think. Yeah, but I think it's interesting, like that last question about the piecemeal, not falling back on dualities, and also thinking the ethical side of this reorientation. Yeah, thank you, Carl.
No, thank you.
We can take Fabian's question as the last question.
Sounds
if
good.
it's fine. Okay. Are you willing to see? Are you willing to see objects or landscapes more as independent agents and less merely as parts of geophysical system? Let's focus on language, how cellular, and an anthropocentric perspective.
I think there's a simple and a very complex answer to this question. I think the simple answer is that yes, I am very willing to see objects and landscapes more as independent agents. The reason, I think there are a couple of reasons why this is not something that I talk about in this presentation. One is that it's kind of a description of a kind of a response to a particular trajectory and trying to seize on a particular kind of tension in geographical thought to kind of destroy it from within. I think that from a certain kind of philosophical perspective, I think like the position that everything is kind of agential is more easily to digest and kind of reckon with than sort of a very hard naturalism according to which not even we are human beings are agents. So I'm more than willing to kind of accommodate that, I think. Now I think it's also I personally am, just to say, I don't know, declaration, I'm for the most part operating in a kind of a framework where I don't understand the kind of landforms and landscapes to have a kind of an agential sense in a kind of as normative agents, in the sense that we do as human beings, and I'm sure there are kind of philosophical consequences to that and vice versa. But in principle, I don't see this as a problem. I feel like the naturalistic kind of extremism is more kind of philosophically problematic in a way. But for me, this is also why it's so kind of interesting and why it has such a kind of bite. If that makes sense. I hope that answers your questions. Your question, sorry, Fabian.
Okay. Yes, thank you. All right. Thanks, Carl.
Thank you.
Great presentation, and really enjoyed it personally.
Yeah.
And thanks for sharing your time with us, time and space.
I hope it was. Just say I hope it was useful for everyone, and do get in touch if you have any more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And the session is recorded just like any other all the sessions, and it will be uploaded on the website of the summit and also on the YouTube channel of the New Center. So you will have access to the session in both of the archives. Thank you so much, everyone, and I will see you all on the 22nd with Renzo Martins. So we'll not be here tomorrow night, but on the 22nd, we'll have a presentation by Renzo Martins.
Thank you.
Thank you, and yeah, absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.